Ladies and gentlemen, we are proud to present Ed Asner in A Man and His Prostate.
A German, an Irishman, and a Jew walk into a bar. Can happen. The German says, "I'm tired, I'm thirsty, I must have beer." The Irishman says, "I'm tired, I'm thirsty, I must have whiskey." The Jew says, "I'm tired, I'm thirsty, I must have diabetes." The point of the joke being the Jews worry excessively about their health. Tonight's show, however, will demonstrate that such fears are not always irrational. Before I start, I'd like to explain the way I'm dressed. You noticed? This is the exact wardrobe I wore on that fateful day in early April 2 years ago when this story begins. It is, as you shall see, a story about life and death. There's also some love in it for those of you who care for that sort of thing. Of course, as you can tell, I'm still alive. So the word death is more rhetorical. At least so far. As you have probably guessed from the title, this play concerns my prostate, located in the lower regions of a man's body. In this case, my body. My body. To those of you who might find explicit descriptions of a man's body distasteful, I'm sorry. That's how the body works. And there's nothing you or I can do about it. The truth must be told. I know there are women who shudder at the very mention of the word prostate, let alone spend a night hearing about one. Let me just say, you have your labias, your vulvas, and your pudendum. And I promise you that if you wanted to share something about any of them, I'd be the last person on earth to run out of this room with my hands covering my ears. That's the kind of guy I am. Just for now. Let's say that the prostate, located about here, and no bigger than a New Zealand kiwi, is one of man's most precious body parts, much talked about, but little understood. Yet, like the vagina of 15 years ago, and you remember the vagina of 15 years ago, don't you? There is much more to the prostate than meets the eye, as I was very soon about to discover. Picture me in an examination room in a public hospital in Florence, Italy. As you can tell by my outfit, it is the last place I expected to find myself. Ah, yes, Neville. Neville, I don't give a good goddamn what time it is in California. I'm in this hospital in Florence, Italy. I collapsed in front of the David. The David. Right on the floor of the academia. Academia. That's where they keep the David, you putz. Will you listen for Christ's sake? Yes, I was on the cruise. It docked in Florence. Yeah. They gave everybody 5 hours to sightsee. You had a choice, Florence or a Shell Oil platform. No, Bernice stayed on board. It was Margarita Monday, and she got sick on the fish tacos. Yeah, her cell goes right to voicemail, and the room phone doesn't answer either. She didn't even know I'm gone. No, I can't go back to the ship. I'll never make it in time. Yeah, I know they have a doctor on board. He led the conga line on costume night, dressed as a pirate of the Caribbean. The ship's headed to Venice by now. They won't know I'm missing. There are 3,000 people on board. You think they take roll call like it was a frickin' submarine? I need you to call Seltzer and find out if he knows a good doctor in Florence. Neville, I'm in this medieval hospital. Yeah. I said I'm in this medieval hospital that looks like it was built by Tiberius. Tiberius! Neville, in the waiting room, they got a black and white TV playing reruns of Baywatch. You gotta find Seltzer. If I knew what was wrong, don't you think I'd tell somebody? Never, you shut up and listen. After Dr. Seltzer, you gotta get through to Bernice. Yeah, I tried the cruise line. All I got was a recorded voice offering me half off on a romantic trip to Tangier. Huh? No, I don't remember the name of the ship. Royal something. Royal Queen. Royal Princess. Royal Ripoff. I told you I don't know the name. I couldn't bend over the rail low enough to read the fucking thing. For Christ's sake, how many ships do you think they have outside Florence this time of year, huh? You gotta call Bernice so she doesn't worry. Neville, I need help. No, it's not stress. Don't give me that crap. Yeah, what? I'm sick. I passed out. They drove me in an ambulance to Florence at 90 miles an hour. Neville, when they were wheeling me in, they were wheeling this dead guy out. And he looked better than I did. That was my business manager, Neville. Why I hired the only Gentile business manager in Los Angeles is beyond me. Now, for those of you who may be wondering how a man of my easygoing temperament, who can't stand going west to Sepulveda, would end up on a cruise in the first place, I have two words. My wife. One day she came home from a charity lunch and told me she had won a cruise to the Mediterranean. Later, when she asked me to write a check to the charity, I calmly explained to her, you don't win a cruise when you outbid everyone at a silent auction. And we had to take a plane to meet the boat in France. I suppose I could have gotten out of it. But the ship would be docking at Rome, Florence, Venice. Yeah. 3 cities we had gone to on our honeymoon. So it's pretty hard to say no to my wife of 35 years and live. A few minutes after I hung up with Neville, 2 doctors came into the exam room. both in white lab coats. The older had a distinguished paternal look to him. The second, much younger, I assume, was an intern and was there simply as an interpreter, since Dr. Marco Carini, whose name I would not learn till much later, he spoke no English. Can you imagine somebody who does not speak English? It's amazing. Asked to describe my symptoms, I had to do so by combining English, my little Italian, and Marcel Marceau. For headaches, I did this. To indicate that I was getting up 9 times a night to take a piss, I went. Nine times. That this morning I hadn't been able to pee at all. So I did this. Zero times. So, Dr. Carini got so agitated, he got up, pointed to the exam table, and signaled that I lower my cargo shorts and my embarrassingly plaid boxers. Before I knew what was happening, Dr. Carini had his hand in a latex glove and one finger deep up my ass. Groaned in pain, and while I was still up there, groaned again. Not so much in pain, but just to let him know this is not the sort of thing I did on a regular basis. I should not have been surprised. After all, he was a urologist. But in the States, where I had at least one complete physical a year for the last 15 years, not one doctor, no matter the specialist, had taken the time to stick his finger up my ass. Despite the fact that it was the fastest, safest, and easiest way to judge a man's prostate. It had become a dying art. Why, I have no idea. But clearly, drop your pants, face the wall, spread your cheeks, had disappeared from medical terminology. Perhaps it wasn't covered by insurance. Perhaps it was no longer taught in med school. Perhaps doctors found it too messy or demeaning to themselves and their patients. My own Dr. Seltzer and I played poker once a week. Perhaps he found it too intimate for a pal he shared corned beef sandwiches with on Friday nights. As for Dr. Carini's immediate diagnosis, I could tell by how far apart he held his hands, the size of a fresh-cut Bronzino. My prostate was disturbingly large. Through his interpreter, he told me I needed to check into the hospital immediately for a battery of tests that would begin the following morning. Within the hour, I was registered and escorted to the hospital room, where I would spend the next week fighting for my life. So here I was in a hospital, which name I couldn't pronounce, in the care of a doctor who spoke no English, with a condition I knew nothing about. The hospital room I was given, 103, was bare and very simple. A window overlooking the parking lot. A clothes closet for those unlike me who had clothes. An archway leading to a full bathroom. A small, narrow bed. And high against one wall, a crucifix of Jesus on his worst day. His head hanging to one side, as if to say, "And you think you got problems?" For dinner, they brought me clear consommé, boiled chicken, steamed carrots, and a baked apple. It was like having dinner at my bubby's house. There was still no word from my wife, or my doctor, or Neville. My phone was dying, and for all I knew, I was too. Perhaps this would be as good a time as any to discuss the reason we are all here tonight, the prostate, what it does, and how. This is a side view of the prostate. Side view. Yeah, that's the side, all right. That's the side view of the prostate. The gland is located between the bladder and the penis. That's what the bladder looks like. The penis, for those of you unable to recognize it, just out of curiosity, who among you does not recognize the penis? Would you stand, please? Nobody's standing. So you all recognize the penis. Oh, good, good, good. The prostate is just in front of the rectum. That's the terminal end, not the terminal end, but the terminal portion of the large intestine. The rectum will be more thoroughly discussed in a later scene. So stick around. This narrow cord, now you see this cord here? That narrow cord runs through the prostate, the urethra, it's called. It runs through the center of the prostate from the bladder to the penis, allowing urine to flow from the body. The second and equally vital function of the prostate is sexual. That is, the prostate secretes fluid gathered in the testes, these little darlings down here, and during ejaculation, squeezes the fluid into the urethra there, and then is expelled through the penis as sperm, assuming that the penis is erect or somewhat erect at the time. Of course, as we all know, the difference between erect and semi-erect is the difference between eating a cheeseburger and licking one. I think we're all informed now. And there you have your prostate, an amazing little gland upon which so much of a man's life depends. And of course, a woman's too, unless she's only in it for the money. You know, I'm not sure if man has a soul, but if he does, it certainly isn't anywhere around in here. No, sir. No, mama. Unfortunately, as men age, the prostate enlarges, creating all kinds of urinary and sexual dysfunction. Perhaps it's just another one of nature's little pranks, like making the male frog carry his wife's eggs in his mouth. Thank God they don't make us do that. Now, to protect ourselves against the prostate's looming vulnerability, we men turn, hopefully, in our early 40s to various natural herbs and remedies. For example, milk thistle, wild yam, and saw palmetto. Now, in the unlikely case that none of those work, there is still hope. One drug out there, available by prescription only, is here to save the day. The billion-dollar drug prescribed by American doctors, above all else, for urinary problems related to the enlarged prostate. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Flomax. Or as I call it, Flow fucking Max. What they don't tell you when they give it to you are the side effects. Flomax has more side effects than divorce. Dizziness from getting up too fast from a sitting position. Dizziness from getting up too slowly from a lying position. Swelling of the lips, tongue, and ankles. Runny nose. Oh my. Runny nose, dehydration, toenail fungus. Not knowing where you are, difficulty breathing, and severe diarrhea and severe constipation. Often at the same time. Unfortunately, erections lasting over 4 hours is not one of them. And that's it, in a nutshell. America's sad arsenal in the war against the enlarged prostate. Meanwhile, we men, like fireflies trapped in a glass jar, flit to our inevitable doom. Early next morning, I was given a battery of tests in quick succession. Blood normal. Blood pressure normal, 130/80. Temperature normal. A full body CT scan normal. Cardiology exam, heart normal. My colon, in fact, was so clean you could eat your supper off of it. Then I was taken to a small, dark room. It's a sad story. A small, dark room for a sonogram. The technician spoke no English, but by his smile I could tell how pleased he was by my carotids. But his smile quickly faded as he began to survey my bladder. He actually said, "Mamma mia," and not in a good way. My bladder was not only full, but contained, clearly visible, floating at the bottom, 7 large and ragged stones that gave the screen the appearance of a bizarre aquarium. You almost expected to see a tropical fish with neon markings swim out from behind one of my stones, sucking for bits of algae. The technician, uttering instructions in rapid, agitated Italian, had an attendant take me back to my room, where I was met by 2 young doctors who performed an immediate catheterization. Let me explain what that entails exactly. This is a side view. First, they inserted a silicone tube into my penis up here. A silicone tube inserted into that thing. And then all the way around, through the urethra, there, the prostate here, and then into my bladder up there. And that, my friends, is no gondola ride down the Grand Canal. Contents of my bladder then drained into a large plastic pouch on the floor beside my bed. None of us could quite believe what poured forth. What seemed like years of backed up urine, along with some odd particles, flotsam and jetsam, you might say, including something that could very well have been leftover egg salad from Henry Winkler's bar mitzvah. In short time, an English-speaking doctor was at my bedside explaining my situation. First off, he told me I had been less than 2 hours from renal failure. In other words, the backed up urine had so overwhelmed my kidneys, they had lost their ability to filter out the toxins in my blood. His second point was, my failure to empty my bladder was the result of my bladder stones and my Bronzino-sized prostate. Third and finally, it was obvious I needed an immediate operation which would remove the stones and reduce the size of the prostate. He described it as a simple operation. They would go in through an opening below my belly button, remove the stones with a tweezer, not through the penis, as was the practice in the States, and slice the inner pit of my prostate, reducing it to its normal size. And all in under an hour. Naturally, I had a few questions. First, who was doing the surgery? Dr. Marco Carini. That was the doctor who put his finger up my ass and whose name I was now learning for the first time. My second question, what would be the side effects? None besides a small scar, said the doctor. And my sex life, after my prostate was sliced. Within a week, came the answer, you will be able to sustain a normal erection. With one slight difference, there will be no visible ejaculation. He went on to be more specific, explaining that after orgasm, the sperm would now travel downwards instead of out. I considered the loss of my ejaculation. How was I to know when sex was over? I'd also developed an attachment to my sperm over the years. Ever since I first pleasured myself to the mental picture of the sexiest movie star at the time, Jane Russell. That picture not only gives you an idea of how old I am, but how little help I needed. Now, the thought of losing my semen bothered me. All my life it had been my big finish. But considering the only other option was death, I signed a consent form. I was to be Dr. Carini's first patient at 8 a.m. the following morning. A half hour later, alone with my fears, my room phone rang. It was Seltzer, my doctor calling from Cancun. How the hell do you think I am? I was 2 hours away from kidney failure. That's how I am. They're operating tomorrow. A doctor who doesn't speak English. Yeah, I'm upset. Of course I am. I cannot believe you're just calling. When I owed you $187 because of that problem with my insurance, your back office hounded me every day for a month. Now it takes you this long to find out whether I'm alive or dead? Huh? 3 weeks ago, you said I was fine. You said I was in great shape. Yeah. Nobody's in great shape when they have to pee 40 times a day. That's so bad I stopped zipping up my fly. What'd you have to see? The piss coming out of my ears? And what did you give me? A prescription for Flow fucking Max. Oh, yeah, that really did the trick. Oh, ho, ho. Answer me. Did you check for toxins in my urine? Huh? No. Did you notice I lost 15 pounds in a week? No. And did you, in the last 10 years, ever once put your goddamn finger up my ass? No. Yeah, there's something you can do. Check out this Dr. Carini. For all I know, he got his degree from the University of Pompeii. Pompeii! There. That's your medical profession for you. Preparations for the operation began early that same night. when 3 female nurses came by to shave my pubic hair. I lay there, any sense of modesty long out the window, and watched serenely fascinated as one foamed my nether region, a second followed close behind with a disposable razor, and a third finished me off with generous shakes of talcum powder. They were followed shortly after by 2 other nurses carrying towels, a bedpan, and bottles of clear, and I figured, specially treated liquids. "Time for caca," said one. Nothing humorous was intended, no. It seemed instead to be their oft-used expression to let patients know it was time to empty their bowels. They helped remove my plaid boxers, positioned me on my side, my knees pressed to my chest, with the bedpan placed strategically under me. They began to administer the bottles of liquid up my behind. When I was full and the bottles empty, one of the nurses called out, almost as a command, "Baño," or toilet time, as I translated it. Then, to my surprise, they left me alone to my own devices. My assumption was that I was to lie there in that position until nature took its course. And so I did. I lay there waiting and waiting and waiting, but nothing happened. At least not what I expected. Instead of movement, there was only noise. The distant rumbling sounds from somewhere deep inside me, soon followed by a strange assortment of curious farts. There's no other way to put it. I was breaking wind in ways previously unheard of by the human ear. There were the sonic booms of overhead jets. Another brought to mind an elderly Vietnamese woman slurping her noodles. And one, the most memorable, was that of a shofar sounding the end of Rosh Hashanah. Tekiah Gadollah! Offhand, I'd say this went on for at least 20 minutes before the 2 nurses returned. Annoyed to see me right where they left me, they practically carried me to the baño and, pointing to the toilet, told me that was where I was supposed to sit. And in a few minutes, finally, the expected results were made manifest. Shaved and evacuated. I love that term. I was ready as I'd ever be for tomorrow's operation. Then the phone rang. It was Seltzer, my LA doctor, who wanted me to know that he'd made some calls to friends of his, professors of medical schools in London. Yes. And the Dr. Marco Carini, my Dr. Carini, was the foremost urologist in all of Europe. I was told the King of Saudi Arabia was a patient of his. And it's too bad I never got the chance to ask Dr. Carini as he stuck his finger up the king's ass to tell him that Ed Asner said hello. The next morning at exactly 7:45, I was wheeled on a gurney into an elevator and up 3 floors to the operating room. Immediately, I was struck by a pervading smell that I thought unusual even for an Italian operating room. The thick aroma of fresh brewed espresso. A few minutes later, the anesthesiologist asked me to sit up. She lifts my gown, finds the spot on my spine she was looking for, and I could feel her needle ever so slightly plunge in. My legs went numb, and then, paralyzed from the waist down, I was hoisted onto the operating table, thinking how amazing it was that FDR had won World War II with legs like these. That, I think, was my last thought before the curtains of my consciousness fell. The show was starting, and all I could do was lie there, a bit player with a walk-on part in my own production. In less than an hour, the operation was over, and I was awakened in what must be typical Italian fashion, the chirping of cell phones ringing and doctors answering, "Pronto?" I could feel my legs again. Nurses wheeled me back to the elevator in a reverse dolly shot as doctors and technical staff, some still on their cells, passed the rear of my gurney like well-timed extras. In the elevator, one of the nurses handed me a vial. In it were 7 stones plucked from my bladder. I opened the vial to get a better look. Up close, they resembled something like oxidized trinkets a deep-sea diver had scraped from a stateroom on the Titanic. I used to take them to parties and show them around until my wife said they made everyone sick. For me, however, no matter how ugly, they were precious souvenirs, which I kept beside my bed like miniature replicas of Stonehenge. Even before I'd settled back into my hospital bed, I noticed boxes piled high in one corner of my room. They contained the individual sacks of distilled water that would be cycled during the next 5 days to cleanse, flush, and launder my bladder until it was finally rid of all of its long-stored impurities. 2 IV poles were placed on either side of my bed. From one, the distilled water connected to my bladder. From the other hung 2 pouches, one of antibiotics, the second of morphine. Which dripped perpetually into my veins. I decided to try my wife again. I called the landline, and this time she answered. The conversation went like this. I need you to come to Florence. I need my sleep mask and pajamas and a robe and slippers. What happened to saying good morning? And why are you yelling? I'm not yelling. You are too. Yes, now I'm yelling. Before I wasn't yelling. I just had a 6-hour operation, and you're actually asking me to say good morning? I lied about the 6 hours. Oh, you'll be fine, she said. You've got the best doctor in the world. As it turns out, she had already heard everything from seltzer. She told me she'd come as soon as the cruise ship docked in Venice, and she could catch a train to Florence. Then she told me how sick she had been. Apparently, food poisoning from the fish tacos had struck half the passengers on board. And the captain, the ship's doctor, and 3 out of the 5 mariachis had to be helicoptered to an army base in Rome. Now, I do not want to give the impression that my wife showed no concern or compassion for my condition. No. This was her way, just as she had for the last 35 years, of making sure I never became too self-centered. Later, I learned when she first heard I was in the hospital and why, she sobbed uncontrollably. By the 3rd day, I was well enough to take small walks down the hall. My catheter strapped to my thigh and carrying my pouch of urine hidden in a shopping bag from Riva Cente's department store, given to me by one of the nurses. Anyway, I looked something like this. Visitors seeing me had to ask, what special item was on sale at Riva Cente that I had rushed out in my hospital gown to buy it? Soon everybody said I was on my way to a full recovery, including Dr. Carini, who stopped by every day to check on my progress. He also told me that, by the way, I did not have cancer. Every year, 250,000 men, American men, are diagnosed with prostate cancer, taking up to 35,000 lives a year. In other words, according to the Prostate Cancer Foundation, a man in this country dies every 16 minutes from prostate cancer. I had dodged a deadly bullet. After a grateful sigh of relief, I talked my nurse into an extra trickle of morphine. It was the closest I could come to toasting my good fortune. I had dodged a deadly bullet. Recently, I came across a list of just some of the men who have died from prostate cancer. Their names are as varied as they are famous. Robert Frost, James Brown, Merv Griffin, Laurence Olivier, Telly Savalas, Bud Abbott, Robert Goulet, Linus Pauling, Dennis Hopper, Eldridge Cleaver, Timothy Leary, Harold Gould, Floyd Patterson, Stokely Carmichael, Don Amici, Charlton Heston, Frank Zappa, Gary Cooper, Langston Hughes, Jerry Orbach, Robert Guillaume, Bill Bixby. It was the Saturday before Easter Sunday, and I could already sense the staff scurrying to finish the chores in anticipation of Italy's most popular holiday, when family and friends celebrated with a midday meal of roast lamb, much wine, and lively talk. But for me, today was the most anxious, if not desperate, day of my life. This was the day that Dr. Carini would decide if I was ready to be released from the hospital. It was 10 in the morning, and I lay there in bed when two doctors from Dr. Carini's staff arrived. They were here to remove my catheter. I didn't watch, so I had no idea how exactly they did it. But in 15 minutes, and with no pain, for the first time in a week, my bladder and penis were back together as a team. The discharge bag was gone. I was now free to piss on my own. The doctors then handed me, somewhat ceremoniously, what is known throughout Italy as a pappagallo. So called because it is shaped like a parrot's beak. I had 4 hours to fill the pappagallo at least halfway with urine. Obviously my own. If I met my mark, it would mean I was functioning normally, and Dr. Carini, who was to arrive at 2 that afternoon, would send me home. If not, it meant I would need a second operation. Large bottles of aqua minerale had been placed by my bedside to ensure success. Wishing me good luck, the doctors left me to get to work. I studied the pappagallo as I drank my first bottle. To me, rather than a parrot's beak, it looked more like a duck decoy. Yeah, only without feathers, hollow, with a 5-inch opening. Instead of a head. I gave it a try. I inserted my penis into the opening, hoping to prompt some response, hoping for even the slightest dribble, perhaps a leak. Nothing came, not a drop. An hour later, another bottle of water gone, and I tried again. But again, nothing. Niente. Duck in hand, I went into the bathroom, thinking it might prove a more conducive atmosphere. With my sadly limp dick inside the duck. How's that for alliteration? I stood, for no reason, over the toilet. I turned on the faucets for inspiration. I pushed, I pulled, I squeezed, I badgered, I cajoled. I massaged my bladder. I cuddled my member like a puppy, as if trying to teach it how to do its business. But again, nothing. The seconds were ticking away. Sweat ran down my forehead. Tears welled in my eyes. It was 1 o'clock. I had an hour left. Time was running out. I went back to my bed and lay there, despondent, with a vacant pappagallo resting on my lap. I cursed my traitorous putz. My mind went into a reverie, thinking back to the good old days when I could stand toe to toe at the long rows of urinals at Dodger Stadium and piss away my beer with the fierce urgency of men half my age. I could not only pee good, I could aim. Once in New York, while taking a shower, I pissed a cockroach down the drain. I began to wonder what kind of God could create a man with an organ like the prostate that grew bigger as the rest of him grew smaller. Only a God with a cruel sense of humor. Like the Old Testament God of Genesis, who commanded Abraham to go circumcise himself at the age of 98. Perhaps it was this thought that had me look up at the crucifix, looking as Jesus was, almost as depressed as I was. I had never been on speaking terms with the Son of God. Certainly never prayed to him. But if ever there was a time to start, it was now. How hard could it be? After all, if Jesus had performed the miracle of turning water into wine, he certainly should have no trouble turning my water into piss. So pray I did. Short and to the point. It surely must have been one of the oddest prayers in the history of Christendom, and not likely to ever find its way into the liturgy. Please, Jesus, I uttered audibly, let me piss into this duck. At least halfway. There may be skeptics who will claim it was simply coincidence. And there will be rationalists who will claim it was because of all the water I drank. But I call it the miracle I had been praying for. Because within minutes, there I was, pissing away. The strong, steady stream that flowed into the Papagallo was as beautiful to my ears as a Beethoven symphony. When Dr. Carini arrived a little after 2 that afternoon, trailed by a troop of his young staff, I held up my duck, filled almost to its neck, like a proud father showing off his newborn son. Dr. Carini beamed with delight, and after a thumbs up to his staff and a pat on the back from me, walked off, like the Lone Ranger riding off into the sunset, leaving the citizens of a once lawless town in peaceful tranquility. Within the hour, I was out on the street in the same absurd outfit I had arrived in, waiting for the cab that had been called for me, on my way to the Grand Hotel, where in 2 days we would be together again. Me, my wife, and my born-again penis. It was Easter Sunday morning, and I was settled in at the Grand Hotel in Florence, a few miles from the hospital. For the first time in 3 years, I'd slept through the night. And I was pissing again at regular intervals, enjoying each trip to the bathroom like a boy with a new action figure. My wife would be arriving tomorrow from Venice, and my mood was good. I guzzled a tiny bottle of scotch from the minibar. My first real drink in a week. And then I lay back in bed, watching TV on the Grand's 42-inch HD flat screen. Almost all of the regular programming was being interrupted by coverage of Pope Francis on the balcony at St. Peter's. delivering his Easter message to 100,000 adoring spectators. While the miracle of water into urine that had taken place the day before was not enough for me to consider conversion, I had nonetheless developed a special kinship to His Holiness and the holiday he was celebrating, the resurrection of my Savior, Jesus Christ. Anyway, as I said, I was flipping channels when I found myself riveted to an insane Italian game show. Whatever the game was, I had no idea, but I was especially taken by one of the hosts, a gorgeous redhead in a low-cut top with breasts even the Pope might look at twice. At every close-up of this game show eye candy, my hand, out of habit, slipped down my boxers and reached for my penis, resting there as if on the shoulder of a trusted friend. I expected a reaction, however minimal. But to my dismay, there was none. That was the moment the awful possibility struck. Despite Dr. Carini's assurances that my sex drive would in no way be affected by a few slices of my enlarged prostate, I was, in fact, impotent. My wife, remember, was only a day away, and the fact that I was not and never would be again the man she had married filled me with instant dread. To explain why, let me give you a little background about my wife and me. Ever since our honeymoon, our sex life had remained the bridge that always got us past and over the crap of everyday life. Surviving 35 years of marriage, 3 children, a live-in mother-in-law, and one unfortunate fundraiser for Ralph Nader. Yeah. Sex had been our permanent and constant connection. That was also a lot of fun. Now here I was with this useless appendage hanging fecklessly between my legs. Perhaps it wasn't me at all, but the stimuli that was the problem. Immediately I switched the TV to the entertainment section, looking for an adult movie, as they were called. Surely some good old-fashioned porn would provide the encouragement I was in such dire need for. Let me just say, I am no fan of pornography. Not only do I find it degrading to women, I am especially troubled by the penis sizes of the male actors. I have to keep reminding myself that the camera can add up to 6.5 inches. But I was now a desperate man. Unfortunately, for an expensive hotel like the Grand, its choice of pornography left much to be desired. For example, my girlfriend's mother goes both ways. Ugh, tui. Don't you hate it when the whole plot of a movie is revealed in the title? And then there were the obvious London boobies and titty glamorama. Yeah, sure. Finally, I found what I hoped would be as provocative and exciting as its title, Brazilian Orgy Night with guest celebrities. But despite the no-holds-barred action on the screen, I remained indifferent, unaroused. It was obvious. I needed someone's hands other than my own. I needed a real woman. So I quickly dressed and rushed out into the street in search of a massage parlor. Now, before you judge me too harshly, consider my circumstances. Consider that I was not pursuing anonymous sex for my own selfish purposes. I was doing this for my wife. And what better instrument than a massage parlor? It wouldn't be expensive. It would be impersonal enough so there'd be no guilt about infidelity. And most important, it would, once and for all, determine my fate as a man and a husband. I hurried to the first cab driver I saw, and I asked him in my best Italian if he knew of a massage parlor con donna. When he understood I was looking for a woman of ill repute, he told me to try the internet and look under escorts. As fast as I could run, I went back to the hotel and stood in the business office in front of the hotel's computer. I logged on using my room number as my password. And typed in escorts, Florence. A second click, and I was faced, incredibly, with a fantasy land of glossy beauties. I could not believe the bodies, the faces, or the underwear. It was as if the gender had produced behind my back a whole new species, exotic, flirtatious, and it seemed desperate for my company at around 200 euros an hour. Remember, I was doing this for my wife. Anyway, their enticing names flew by. Talia, Brigitta, Rebecca, Daniela Ladyboy. Next to each name were their pictures in various and delectable poses. Some I had to tilt my head almost upside down to see their faces. Each picture came with a brief description. Daniela Ladyboy, for example, described herself as completely shaved. Perfect! I was recently shaved myself. We had something to talk about. Yes, sir. Now, despite everything I've said, I know what many of you must be thinking. A married man at his age, soliciting a prostitute to come to his hotel room for sex. Well, believe me when I tell you, I was as disgusted with myself then as you are now. But in my feverish mind, my hotel room would become the laboratory in which I'd conduct the protocols of a purely scientific experiment. Could I disprove my worst fears? After all, my marriage was at stake. Back in my room, after copying a long list of names and numbers, I hit the phone. But there was not one answer. Some numbers I called twice. No one picked up. There was one name left, Yuko, who specialized in Oriental massage. Terrific, I thought. It's what I wanted from the beginning. The fates were finally turning my way. And of course, I don't have to remind you who I was doing this for. I was doing this. I called Yuko's number. A soft voice answered that had the gentle tinkle of a wind chime outside a Buddhist temple somewhere in Kyoto. I'm looking for a massage, I said. Oh no, no massage today. It's Easter Sunday. As I hung up, I caught my reflection in a darkened TV screen. I took a long, hard look. What the hell was I thinking? Looking for a hooker in Italy on Easter Sunday? It was now evening, and I was exhausted. Not getting any sex had taken its toll. The doctors at the hospital had given me a pain remedy that also helped me sleep. I reached for it. A small glass vial that I had to break and insert into the accompanying syringe. I bent over, ass in the air, like so many of those women in their pictures, and shot myself in the right buttock. Soon, I fell into not so much a sleep, but a fitful coma. So it felt more like a dream than the real thing, when much later, I felt my wife slip into bed beside me. I hope I'm in the right room, she whispered in my ear. I could feel her warm caress against my weary, scalpel-carved body. Gently, she massaged my neck, her fingers feathering across my shoulders. Her lips dipped and kissed the exact spot on my spine where the anesthesiologist had plunged her needle. Then a few more kisses, random, here, there, and there again. And even in my semi-conscious state, I felt myself begin to heal. I looked past my wife's naked shoulder towards the window where a shaft of light came slicing through the half-open drapes. The sun was coming up, and so, my God, was I. Later, as we sat on the edge of our bed, wolfing down plates of our American breakfast, I made my confession. Did you notice anything different about me? You know, when we were having sex. You know why? She asked, her mouth full of brioche. You didn't notice that there was an orgasm, but no ejaculation. It's a side effect of the operation. The semen doesn't come out. It goes backwards. Backwards where? I don't know. I guess from wherever it came from. All I know is that from now on, there is no more semen. Well, frankly, that was always my least favorable part. And that was the end of that. I'd like to thank all of you for coming here tonight and letting me share my prostate with you. It means a lot, especially since my wife won't let me talk about it anywhere else. And now a toast. L'chaim. To life. Or as it says in the Italian song you heard at the beginning, to live. To live. Always to live. As if we never had to die.